Hey everyone, welcome to week 4. In this lecture, we're going to be going over chapters 4 and 5, homeostatic systems and how drugs work. So we're going to be talking about how drugs work in the body and the brain. This is, I think, one of the most exciting and informative chapters, so I hope you find it interesting as well. So when we say the word homeostasis, we're talking about balance. We're talking about internal and external, the body self-regulating based on internal and external changes in the environment. Okay, so the nervous system is going to change and adapt to changes in the environment. So if you recall our trauma neuroscience conversation about how environment and epigenetics is going to change the way that the brain's wired, you can think of it that way. But essentially we're looking for balance. So something that we're going to talk about later on in the class is what we call down regulation. So just to give you a quick example, when we give our body something artificially, it is if it is made naturally. Let's take melatonin for instance. If you take melatonin for sleep and you take it habitually or chronically, if you take it frequently, we also make melatonin. So our body is going to downregulate and stop making it because we're getting it artificially. So that's an example of how homeostasis works in the brain and the body. We are going to have a brief introduction to the nervous system. So we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. There are two major types of cells in this system. We're going to be talking about neurons, which we'll break down here in a minute, as well as glia, which are the filler or supporting cells around the neurons. Neurons are responsible for conducting and receiving and sending electrical chemical information throughout the brain. Okay, and we'll see what that looks like here in a second. So let's watch this first, and then we will go ahead and come back to this. So this is how synaptic transmission works. So just to give you a little bit of a background here, we're going to go over all of the functions and the parts of a cell here in a second. But this is going to show you how neurochemicals are released and absorbed. So we have a presynaptic cell, so the cell that comes first, and then we have a postsynaptic cell that has receptor sites. Okay, so the electrical chemical process is moving this way. Okay, this space here is called the synapse. So neurochemicals such as oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine are released by the presynaptic cell into this space, and this is where the magic happens, if you will. This is where euphoria comes about. This is where impacts of substances happen. So we ingest a substance, it releases neurochemicals into this space. This is where we get the high, if you will, and then it is reabsorbed. Okay, so let's take a look at that. excuse me. So with that being said, there are a couple terms in here that you'll read throughout your book, such as action potential. But how we've defined that here is through euphoria or the experience that a drug gives us. Okay. So how this neuronal messaging works. Okay, so he explained it brilliantly in that video. But it is an impulse that moves from that presynaptic to the postsynaptic cell. This impulse releases chemical messengers called neurotransmitters, and we're going to go over various neurotransmitters in a minute. And that based on the neurochemicals that are released will determine whether the cell gets excited or inhibitory. So whether it slows things down or speeds things up. Okay. If you're getting lost, stay with me. We already talked about this, but we're going to come back around to this neuronal messaging here in a minute. This is a neuron. Okay. So when I think about dendrites, I think of them as the fingers. Okay. So they pick things up from other neurons. And then this other side here, this arm leading out here is what we call the axon. So the information comes in this way and leaves through the axon. Okay. And then right here, that microscopic space is called the synapse or the synaptic cleft, synaptic gap. They all mean the same thing. So this is the junction between the two neurons in which those neurotransmitters are released, and it sends a message to this cell saying, again, be excited or be inhibited, excuse me. The nucleus is the brain of the cell, so this is what keeps the power going, keeps the lights on, if you will. And then the myelin sheath is a fatty insulating layer that allows improves the transmission or helps the transmission along. It's for efficiency. And those glial cells, so these non-neuronal, they're called non-active cells, but they're not non-active. What they do is they actually provide support and protection for the neuron, excuse me, and they produce this myelin sheath. Okay, so we need both. Okay. We talked about those neurotransmitters being chemical messengers from glands and neurons that exert their effects by interacting with special protein regions called receptor sites. So we can think of these as like a lock and key, okay? Certain neurotransmitters will get into certain receptors. For example, when we think about opiates, opiates are received by a mu receptor, okay? If you are familiar with methadone or Suboxone, which is medication-assisted treatment to help folks in recovery from opiate dependence. How that works is methadone will actually sit in this receptor site, and when it will, disable withdrawal. Okay, so because that mu receptor is being filled, it's not necessarily with opiates, it is with a substitution medication, but the brain just knows that that receptor is being filled, therefore withdrawal is not occurring. With Suboxone, it is a partial agonist, okay, or buprenorphine, where it partially fills this mu receptor. And it also has naloxone in it, which is what we call a blocker. So if you were to use opiates while using bup, the opiate neurotransmitter wouldn't be able to enter. Okay. Sometimes we also prescribe folks just naloxone of itself, and it will block these receptor sites. Narcan, which is used to bring people back after an overdose, is actually strong enough to kick opiates out of these receptor sites. So just an example of what that looks like. So some of the common neurotransmitters of the brain that are affected by drugs of abuse are dopamine. So this is the pleasure chemical. Okay. It's known to cause euphoria in large amounts, agitation, paranoia, and it also can change the way that we move and the way that we interact with space. We certainly see this with amphetamines, methamphetamines, and other stimulants. Dopamine is actually purged when we use methamphetamine drugs. And if you remember going back to this, so what happens with methamphetamine is our dopamine is purged from this cell at an accelerated rate. It floods the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft, increasing, and you get a lot of euphoria from meth, lots of increased dopamine, at least at first. It will eventually stop because you won't have any more dopamine. But what happens is, you remember, based on that video, we talked about diffusion. So ideally, we want to release dopamine, and then we want it to be, want it to experience reuptake, go back into the cell and get recycled. But when it gets purged by methamphetamine use, it dissipates and dies. Okay. It doesn't get recycled because the cell doesn't have enough energy or enough means to pull it all back in, so it dies or diffuses. Okay. It is hard to get that back. Meth is one of the harder substances for long-term recovery because the dopamine production just simply, it takes a long time for it to come back. Okay. Well, while it won't kill you necessarily like benzos or alcohol, sometimes opiates, it is very painful and very impactful to your mental health. GABA is a neurotransmitter that we see with alcohol and benzodiazepines. Okay. So this is an inhibitory effect, meaning it slows us down, might make us feel sedated, relaxed, drowsy. Okay. Barbiturates, which we'll talk more about next week, not very common anymore. They're kind of the precursor to benzodiazepines. Serotonin, I think we touched a little bit on this last week, is responsible for the regulation of mood as well as our ability to sleep and relax. It is an inhibitory, kind of a peaceful, warm, fuzzy type of neurotransmitter, and we do see serotonin impacted by hallucinogens, so LSD, MDMA, psilocybin. And also, something to be careful about is when you are treating folks, if they are using hallucinogens, they really need to be careful if they're also prescribed depression medication known as SSRI or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, because again, hallucinogens are increasing the amount of serotonin that is released into the synapse. And serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters that gets recycled. And so, again, similar-ish to the meth, if we're purging too much of it, it won't get recycled. And serotonin is actually primarily produced in the gut. So if we're not eating whole foods, foods that are, how do you say, productive to the microbiome, our serotonin production is going to be stunted. Okay, so diet is also a very important piece of recovery. Acetylcholine can be both excitatory and inhibitory, but mostly we tend to feel stimulated and focused. Okay, you might even get a mild euphoria, and we tend to see this with nicotine products. Okay, you might even get a little bit of a racing heart, increased blood pressure. Sometimes it also calms us down, right? Endorphins, so these are the neurotransmitters that are released when we use opiates or other narcotics. Okay, this is inhibitory, so again, slows things down, shuts things off. Can create mild to extreme euphoria. It blocks pain, it slows our respiration, and for many of us, could reduce stress. Anandamide is also an inhibitory effect, responsible for relaxation and a sense of well-being. So this is typically released before bed, after a big meal, after good sex, something like that. Also, the brain reads it the same way that it reads THC. So this is affected by marijuana use. And we see a pretty substantial downregulation in chronic marijuana users. There was a longitudinal study released pretty recently. So what that means is a study that looked at folks over 20, 30 years. And they found that primarily folks were using marijuana to address anxiety, but they had worse anxiety symptoms after 20, 30 years of using marijuana. And so one of the reasons for that is the reduction of natural anandamide. Body stops making it. Sometimes it'll never make it again to the same degree that it was naturally before. And that depends on dosage, how long you've been using it, that kind of thing. But also, marijuana interrupts what we call REM sleep. So it's the stage of sleep that we dream. More importantly, it's the stage of sleep where we process stress. And having interrupted REM sleep, and we're not talking about psychological stress only, I'm also talking about stress on the organs, stress on cells. It's very important that we reach that stage of sleep. And chronic marijuana use, again, even though it does help folks sleep, it does help folks with anxiety, in the long term, it's detrimental. So we talked about downregulation. So the brain produces less of a neurotransmitter when the brain obtains it artificially from substances, prescriptions, that kind of thing. But the brain is very adaptable and malleable. Okay. So when we enter recovery, for example, let's take recovery from marijuana, it's going to take a long time. Or methamphetamine, for instance, it's going to take a long time for the brain to reach that normal baseline again. And it might never reach that again. And we learn there are certainly ways that we can cope with that. So more about the nervous system here. I apologize, I just realized I'm actually not looking at the slideshow. So different components of the nervous system. So we're talking about the CNS and the PNS, so the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is what we primarily call the nervous system. It includes the brain and the spinal cord. So it receives incoming information from all of our senses, and also controls our state of arousal, our state of alertness, and it includes the limbic system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And we're going to go into those here in a sec. The peripheral nervous system includes all of your nerves. Okay. So we have the spinal cord, and then we have the nerves that come off of this. And then we also have certain neurons that receive and carry information. So motor neurons carry signals from the central nervous system to the outer parts of the body. Okay, so it tells the body to move, tells the body to sweat or to feel pain. Okay, and sensory neurons carry the information the other way. So for instance, if we experience trauma to the body, a cut or something like that, or heat, telling the body to slow down or cool off, those are called sensory neurons. So motor neurons bring information out, sensory neurons bring information in. The limbic system is responsible for our emotions and memory. Okay, so the storage of memories and how memories are formed. This is a very complex process. I would suggest, if this is something that's really interesting to you, checking out The Developing Mind by Dan Siegel. It's pretty wordy and academic, but I think if you were if you were patient and willing to look things up, and he really explained this very well. Function of the limbic system is to regulate emotional activities, memory, reward, and endocrine activity. So endocrine is the hormones of the body. It includes the nucleus accumbens, which is the brain's reward center. So that nucleus accumbens is going to be responsible for determining whether something is rewarding or aversive. Okay. So it's going to store our experience or store our memory in a way that remembers this is pleasurable, this is good, or it's going to store it in the place that says avoid at all costs. This is scary, this is threatening. Okay. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for our bodily functions that are automatic, or what feels automatic. Okay. So our heart rate, digestion, respiratory rate, breathing, the way that our pupils expand and contract due to light, urination, and sexual arousal. While we do have some control over urination and sexual arousal to some degree, these things are going to happen automatically, but sometimes we can control it. And this system also includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is the system responsible for preparing us for fight or flight. It is our threat system, okay? And it's going to tell us what we should do. So it's this kind of, how do you say, innate thing that gets our body ready for threat, okay? So some of the things that it does, so it releases this kind of like hormonal soup from the adrenal glands. So these are glands that are right above the kidneys, okay? It releases cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, excuse me. So cortisol is responsible for storing fat or having food reserves that's stored differently so that we can run or fight, so we can save energy, okay? Adrenaline, if you've ever seen somebody in an emergency lift up a car or do something that seemed unhuman, that's due to adrenaline, okay? Or these chemicals are preparing our body to fight, to survive, okay? So it increases our heart rate, it opens the bronchial tubes around the lungs, allowing us to breathe deeper, okay? It slows down the digestive system to store energy, makes us more alert, stimulates the sweat glands, and dilates our blood vessels. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is the system which its function is to bring the body back from fight or flight. And for those of us who have experienced trauma or adversity, especially prolonged trauma and adversity during developmental stages of life, the system can be a little bit wonky. It's not broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But our recovery might look like finding ways to jumpstart it. Okay. So the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system are going to be the opposite of the sympathetic. It's going to decrease our heart rate, stimulate secretions in the lungs. I apologize about that typo. It's going to reactivate our salivary glands, get our digestive system back on, okay? Bring that alert system down. So now moving on to how drugs function. So drugs of abuse affect our brain in one of two ways primarily. They either imitate something we make naturally, or they artificially change the level of neurotransmitters entering that space, either by overstimulating or inhibiting the reabsorption. For example, mimickers. So we talked about THC, anandamide, or THC mimicking anandamide, okay? Opiates also mimic endorphins, okay? So if you've ever been on pain management and stopped taking pain medication, and all of a sudden you got pain in all these places you didn't even know existed, that's because your brain has stopped making that natural pain reliever, okay? Blockers, so a couple examples of blockers: cocaine, SSRIs. So again, SSRIs are going to block that reuptake. They're going to block, there's going to be a block to those receptor sites, thus leaving the serotonin, hence it being called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it blocks that serotonin from recycling, leaving it out in the synapse for longer, and the theory is that will increase our mood. Okay, there's much more to it than that, but that was the original theory. Also, cocaine has a similar effect on the system where those receptor sites are blocked, and we see that level of serotonin and dopamine stay in the synapse for longer because the reuptake is blocked. And we talked about meth being one of those flutters that purges all of the dopamine. Okay. So we've talked a lot about substance abuse, but what we haven't really touched on yet is what we call process abuse or process addictions. So behavioral addictions such as gambling, sex, shopping, eating can cause dopaminergic responses in the brain, just like drugs do. We've actually seen brain scans of folks who abuse illicit substances like crack, and then folks who abuse something like sugar, and the same parts of the brain light up. Process addiction can be just as detrimental to the brain, to the body, to our lifestyle as substance use. Okay, typically it won't kill us, and we're not going to have a withdrawal that is going to need medical attention per se. We might need treatment, but you do also experience withdrawal with process addiction. It's just not a physical withdrawal. Okay, but you do have a psychological or physiological withdrawal. You can. So this is just pretty straightforward how drugs can impact the body. So some drugs can cause insomnia, drowsiness, hallucinations, and psychosis. Keep in mind any kind of substance, so like stimulants that are going to keep you awake for extensive amounts of time, hallucinations and psychosis are likely. Okay. Blurred vision, bloodshot eyes can be caused by alcohol, PCP, marijuana. The lungs can be impacted by anything that you would smoke. Okay. Heart, so we're talking about primarily stimulants there. Okay. Cirrhosis, so alcohol affects the liver to an extreme degree. Stomach can be affected most by narcotics. Kidneys can be affected by caffeine and alcohol, and narcotics tend to cause constipation. And there are many other side effects that come along with this. So many factors can affect the way an individual responds to a drug. So depending upon how the drug is administered, so smoking is the quickest way. And then we're talking about intravenous use. You can also take a drug orally. Drugs have also been known to be inserted in the rectum. Okay. I've seen stories of drugs being placed in the eye, LSD, and be snorted. Okay, some drugs can be snorted. So it depends on how it's administered, obviously how much you're taking. If you've done it before, if you have any kind of tolerance or cross tolerance, which we'll talk about in a second, the potency of a substance, so how strong is that LSD or how strong is that heroin? Okay. The rate of absorption, so this can be affected by metabolism and whether or not we've eaten. How it distributes throughout the body, so this is going to be, again, somewhat based on metabolism and blood flow, so it depends on the genetic makeup of who we are. How it's metabolized and eliminated. Okay, are we going to the bathroom normally? So, like I said, inhalation is typically the, I'm sorry, this is incorrect. Inhalation is the quickest way to get drugs to the brain. IV drug use is second, okay? And then we're talking about nasally and rectally, or the same depending on what you're using. Orally tends to be the slowest acting route of administration, and intramuscular typically isn't folks do steroids in this manner, but typically this isn't an ideal way to use substances. Most of the time we see intramuscular use for things like heroin or cocaine or meth when intravenous means are no longer available. So doses for the effect. So a couple things that I want folks to be familiar with is the term threshold dose. So this is the minimum amount of a drug necessary to have an effect. Okay. So in order to feel it, what kind of dosage do we need? And then we see the plateau or the ceiling effect, which is the maximum effect a drug can have regardless of the dose. So buprenorphine or Suboxone is something that has the ceiling effect. Once you reach a certain amount, there is no more benefit that can come from taking more. Then we see a cumulative effect. So the buildup of drug concentration in the body due to multiple doses taken within short intervals. Okay. So we see this a lot in opiate or heroin use, where somebody used maybe a little bit earlier and then they took a little bit later a dose, a higher dose that they would normally maybe take, and they're still feeling the effects, that cumulative effect of the dose that they took earlier, which could lead to overdose. So tolerance, so again, this is how our response to a drug becomes diminished and we need more to get that same effect or that same high. We also see what's called reverse tolerance, mostly with alcohol. So let's say somebody is able to drink large amounts and then they get some kind of liver damage from alcohol, and very, very small amounts will leave them intoxicated because of that damage. The liver is no longer able to process the alcohol, therefore, a very small amount intoxicates them. We also see a phenomenon called cross tolerance. So typically, there's only a couple substances we see this with. So like opiate related products, so like morphine and heroin. We also see this with alcohol and benzos. So if I have a high tolerance to alcohol or benzos, I'm likely going to have, let's say I have a high tolerance to alcohol, I'm also likely to have a high tolerance to benzodiazepines. Okay, so alike substances. With alike substances, you might experience cross tolerance. So some terms that I would like people to familiarize themselves with: homeostasis, neurons, neurotransmitters, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, and just general definitions. Like you don't have to get real specific here. Intended and unintended responses, what does that mean? Potency of a substance, toxicity, acute and chronic drug response, okay? Reverse tolerance and cross tolerance. So be familiar with these terms. And here are some additional resources if you'd like to learn more. Also, please check out the optional resources this week, and let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.